Well, hello, one and all, and welcome to Agree or Disagree the podcast. My name is Kevin Olenick. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE. Like Agree or Disagree the podcast on Facebook. Follow at A or D the podcast on Twitter. Add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenick, or find me on all social medias as KEVOLE, or you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm not really known to talk a lot about wrestling today, but this is our topic today. Usually talk about some other things, but I have followed wrestling for a good chunk of my life, and one of my favorite wrestlers growing up was Owen Hart, and we're going to review the Dark Side of the Rings episode of Owen Hart's tragic passing of May 23rd, 1999. And we're going to talk about that episode. We're going to talk about some of the things that were revealed in the episode. We're going to talk about some of the things that were probably a little bit missed, or things that I would have liked to have seen. And we're going to also just talk a bit about what could have been. I have a couple of wrestling scenarios that I could have seen happen had Owen been alive. But just to kind of get us started from my perspective of Owen Hart, I remember going to my first wrestling. I watched Stampede Wrestling on TV when I was a kid. I remember Ed Whalen being the play-by-play guy. He was the play-by-play guy for the Calgary Flames. For those who don't know, I grew up in Calgary, and I've moved to BC here and lived here for the last 4 or 5 years. But I grew up in Calgary. I remember the Harts, and I remember Stampede Wrestling, and I remember seeing Dynamite Kid, Davey Boy Smith, Bret Hart, Bruce Hart, Keith Hart, Brian Pillman, Bad News Allen, Gama Singh, Mukka Singh, Jim Neidhart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. A lot of these guys that we saw in future WWE or future wrestling, we got to first see Dr. David Schultz. I remember watching him in Stampede Wrestling. A lot of those stars, of course, got their start at Stampede Wrestling, and the Harts as a family, always remember the Harts as a family whenever they would substitute teacher at any school, and they did it once or twice at a couple of schools. Where I was going, there was just an electricity in the air whenever a Hart would enter a building. They were the royalty, in a sense, of Calgary. Up there, probably so well known. Presented themselves as a really classy part of Calgary, just had this calm sort of demeanor, and all of the Harts played good guys on television during the time, and they were great. But my favorite was Owen. He just had something a bit different than everyone else. Just his high-flying acrobatic abilities. He just did things I never could imagine. He was such a natural. If you ever go back and watch some Owen Hart matches from Stampede Wrestling, especially, and I will also recommend, as we go through this, a good companion piece is Chris Jericho's Talk is Jericho podcast that he interviewed Martha Hart on, and kind of talked about his matches at Stampede Wrestling and in Japan. But I remember watching his matches with Mukka Singh, and they were just, they were really great matches. He had great matches with a lot of different people too. Larry Cameron. He just matched up so well with everybody, and there was just something different. And then when he came to the WWE, and debuted as the Blue Blazer. I remember with my friend Paul watching that wrestling match that it was called Maple Leaf Wrestling at the time, and it was on every Saturday, and we would record it and then watch it a little bit later, and then rewind it back. We rewound this Blue Blazer came to the ring, and it looked familiar to us like it did to Chris Jericho when he watched. So I related to what Jericho said there, and just watch this guy do this flips and all of this, and it looked familiar. And the distinction too was his nose, the Blue Blazer's nose. Owen had a distinct nose to me. Don't ask me why I look at his nose. It's just that was one of the things I remember. Remembered his nose. And yeah, sure as heck that we watched, sure as hell, it was Owen Hart, and we just lost it because Owen Hart was in the WWE, and he started as the Blue Blazer, and then I remember the day that this happened. I remember that day that he passed. I was out with some friends for the night. Came home late, came home around midnight, Alberta time, just turned on the TV, and for the last thing that was on the news, I didn't have cable at the time, but the last thing that there was this highlight of Owen Hart, and I went, that's weird that they would show a highlight of Owen Hart. I wonder why that is. And then I found out the next morning that he died, and that whole week, I was just in shock. And I've never met Owen Hart personally, and never knew him, but it felt like one of my better friends died. It was just so stunning to me. So I always, I'll always remember the passing, and kind of remember where I was. Owen, he's one of those people that I will always remember. When they ask about celebrities, where were you when? Owen Hart is one of them for me, for sure. And the documentary talks a little bit about how Calgary was reacted. I remember the Calgary Sun page that had Owen Hart and the wrestlers that came in and stuff. But so just had a real, for me, this one was more than the Montreal screw job, because the Montreal screw job has been talked about over and over and over again. This one I really was interested in watching. This was the one I was looking forward to. Wrong choice of words, but this is one I was the most interested in how they would handle. And of course, the guests that they had Chris Jericho doing the narration. He also gave his, he did some interviews. He had Jim Ross, who called that card in Kemper Arena in Kansas City, and Jim Cornette, who was an executive at the time at the WWE, managed Owen Hart a bit. Of course, we heard from Dr. Martha Hart. We heard from his kids, his son Oj and his daughter Athena. And just remembering these pictures of these little kids that Owen was carrying around, that you just see now speaking in such eloquent terms, was just something else. And we'll get to Oj and Athena in a moment. But in terms of people that I did want to hear from, in terms of wrestling people, and I understand the politics of this, but it would have been nice to hear from a Jeff Jarrett, if it was at all possible. Owen and Jeff were very close. It would have been interesting to hear Jeff Jarrett's opinion. I think because Jeff Jarrett is employed with the WWE, you obviously were not going to get that. Even Steve Austin, who's also employed by the WWE, it would have been interesting to hear him. And I do think that there was a little bit of a miss there, of as much as Owen and Brett had some great matches. that Owen Hart Steve Austin story, and part of the rise of Steve Austin, and was because of his feud with Owen Hart. I think that the documentary missed a little bit talking a little bit about that feud, because that, as much as the Bret Hart feud elevated Steve Austin, Owen was a bit different, because it was, yeah, I mean, it wasn't the WrestleMania moment, but one of the best pay-per-views of all time was the Canadian Stampede, when Austin and the Road Warriors and Goldust faced the Hart family, and that crowd went nuts for everybody. That was just a crazy night. And then that Austin Owen Hart feud continued into before Austin ended up going on to face Shawn Michaels and feud with Shawn Michaels at that for that WrestleMania. So I do think that the documentary did miss that part, and I do understand that you only have about an hour, but if there was a part of Owen Hart's history that I do think I would have loved to have seen in it, that part would have been great to see, because as much as he was stammering around a little bit, he did get a wrestler he did help to get Steve Austin over. So that was missed a little bit. And of course, obviously, we didn't hear from them, but I would have liked to have heard from them. But at least in terms of the start here, in terms of history, it's just, it was good to see some of the Stampede footage. And it was good to see all of that. They talked a little bit about one of Owen's biggest win of his career, no doubt, was the WrestleMania 10 match that he had with Bret Hart. That's one of the better matches in WrestleMania history. Got Owen over. It started, as Jim Ross talks about in the documentary, about how he gets them up starts to get him onto that next level. And they showed the picture in a little bit later on in sort of clips of Owen, but the highlight of that, and this was also, it wasn't only Owen's wrestling ability that was so great, it was his facial expressions, and he could pull the comedy, he could pull the seriousness, he could do both, and he made, when Bret Hart won that title at WrestleMania 10, when he beat Yokozuna, there was the crowd in the ring, all of the wrestlers come in and celebrate, they lift Bret Hart, and then in the distance is Owen Hart, and he gives that look, and you know that he's the next contender. We know that that's where that's going, and do recommend not only that match, WrestleMania 10, but if you look back at some of those Bret Owen matches, there were some really good matches there that you can watch, and you can kind of know what Owen Hart's ability was, and what Chris Jericho was saying, because he was doing a lot of the stuff that we like now, he was doing already. And the documentary, Chris Jericho talked about that. Jim Ross talks about him. I mean, he was a star as soon as you see him, and and I think fans gravitated towards him, and he, whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, he was certainly entertaining. And so in terms of that, in terms of telling the Owen Hart beginning, this was a pretty well done part, as I said. I think missing the Stone Cold part, I think, was a bit of a miss, but overall, I did enjoy that. Then we get, of course, to the actual, we talk a little bit about the incident here. We get into the incident and the night before, and both Oj and Athena here, I thought both of them were, and Martha, were just, they were great. For me, Martha's demeanor throughout, you can very much see that this is a woman that loved her husband and would do anything for her husband. It's just, to me, is the purest of human loves. It was just, it's so hard to describe how that looks to me or how that felt to me, but it was there. And just this remarkably composed, remarkably thoughtful person Martha was. And, you know, going through what she did, and we'll get to where I getting the anger, and not at Martha, by the way, but the anger part here. Oj just had some incredibly poignant things to say. That the line he says is his last word. I mean, I don't know what got me to was when Oj says the last words he heard from his dad is "take care of your mom and your sister," and talking about the trains and how life was so fun. And just, I just felt for Oj throughout this. But I got to tell you the other thing that he's a human rights lawyer. I think we're going to see Oj in the political world one day, and I will not be surprised if we see Oj as a leader in a political party one day. He's got that kind of charisma. He's got that kind of passion. It came across when he talked about the Owen Hart Foundation specifically. And, yeah. And Athena, we did not see much of Athena here. But her words about if it wasn't for wrestling, we still would have her dad. Just those words broke my heart for her. She was only 3 when this all happened. I just feel for her, going through life, being known as the wrestler's daughter, going to the same school as Owen Hart, as her dad. And I'm sure just from seeing her Twitter, she's going to be doing some great things. So I think it was really great to hear from Oj and Athena, and it was, of course, obviously very important to hear from Martha for this as well. And I think going through this, one of the things that I do think became a big change, and I think what I'm glad this documentary and these interviews and this brought out is, I think Martha has been painted as the villain here, because Martha has not allowed the WWE to, and I'm using air quotes here, honor Owen. And when you hear the story and you remember this story, I think it's very fair to understand where Martha is coming from. And I thought that this documentary pointed this out very well. And this is where just I feel so much anger towards, and I think the WWE have to answer more questions than flipping blame with lawyers on Martha Hart, which they did with a statement of CBS that Martha was not interested in the truth. There was a CBS statement, for those who don't know, that after these interviews that the WWE came up, and I'm just going to pull this up here, that they said, and I'll read it word for word. Jerry McDevitt, representative of the for the WWE, basically said Martha was not even remotely interested in finding out what happened that night. She just wanted to use it as a vehicle to beat up a business that she didn't like her husband was in, the wrestling business. And Martha Hart did respond to these comments. In response to Jerry McDevitt's recent comments, I want to make it very clear, if there was one person on this planet who wanted to get to the bottom of what happened to my husband Owen, it was me. The defense, on the other hand, was doing everything in their power to muddy the waters, as they tried to continue to do, in an effort to distract from the case because they didn't have one. I read every single affidavit taken, sat through endless face-to-face depositions, and spent over a year of my life dissecting every solitary fact of this case. To insinuate for 1 second that I, of all people, did not care about the truth behind Owen's death, but instead was more interested in a ridiculous vendetta against a wrestling business, is beyond the pale. Jerry McDevitt's comments are absolutely absurd, reckless, and pathetic. I am not surprised that the WWE would trot out Mr. McDevitt to do damage control. After all, the events surrounding the Owen's death and the aftermath that followed are extremely disturbing and do not are extremely disturbing, and do not reflect well on their company. And this is probably one of the deep dives that has been done in terms of what happened that night. Basically, for those, it's quite simple. They revised the character that Owen Hart debuted in the Blue Blazer. And as the documentary talked about, it was supposed to be a spoof on Sting. It was a comedy character. And he was going down the ring through this harness like Sting did, like Shawn Michaels did at a WrestleMania, where the boyhood dream came true. He comes down. He's supposed to do the same thing. He did it before, but this time was obviously a little bit different. And they talk about what happened the day before. And in terms of that night, of course, the Godfather's also in this. They also interviewed the Godfather and D'Lo Brown. The Godfather was supposed to have the match with Owen Hart that night. And Owen enters, and Jimmy Corderas was also in this documentary as well. He was refereeing that match. And to hear their descriptions from Jimmy's view, from Jimmy Corderas' view, from Jim Ross's view, just sort of, it's kind of, it just gave me a little bit of chills just hearing how that sounded. And even Jim Cornette's words at the last words that you heard from him were "look out," and Jimmy Cornette said it just heard something, and then you turn around and you saw Owen's body there. I probably also would have liked to have heard a little bit more from Jimmy Corderas as well, but maybe again there's some politics around that. I don't know. I'm just, I'm giving that feedback in terms of what I would like to hear, I truly did feel for Jim Ross here in terms of, and Jerry Lawler, of how both of them had to handle this. They were given, and I did not know this, but Kevin Dunn, one of the executive producers in WWE, thought JR knew and gave him basically, Owen Hart died, you're on in 10-9. And it's just unfathomable to imagine that you would give somebody 10 seconds to process a guy that he brought into the company, that he is watching, he is analyzing, he's preparing, and he was also a high executive in an influential position at the time in WWE, that you would give him 10 seconds to do that. And I'm glad they got the replay of that footage to just watch Jerry Lawler's face and because Jerry Lawler's face to me said it all at that point, just how they felt. And it's such a cold, and I guess Martha Hart could not have said it any better, saying just a piece of garbage. That's how Owen Hart was treated that night. And no matter how you look at it, that they did a tribute the next night, that show went on. Those matches, 4 or 5 other matches, went on. And there's a scene on Twitter, there's a picture on Twitter showing The Undertaker going into the ring that night, and you could see the tears. They showed Jeff Jarrett, but I can't imagine for a performer how easy it would have been to even go through that in terms of an emotional part. But even from an investigative part here, I think we should have heard. A couple of other people would have liked to hear from the Kansas City Police Department and the arena, and even from the arena at the time, a representative to that. So why in the living hell did they not themselves, if Vince McMahon was not going to stop the show, and that's, if you know anything about WWE, they refused to stop. They were going on when everyone else was closing here during our quarantine times here. They were going on doing empty shows at arenas. Even back at 9/11, they put on a show the next night. They live with the show must go on. That's part of their mentality. Whether you, pardon the pun for this podcast, agree or disagree with it, that's who they are. That's what they've done. But for me, I want to understand why the Kansas City Police Department or the arena or somebody there on that end didn't stop this show. And I would have liked to heard more also from some fans that were there if that was at all possible. Did anybody walk out of that show? Did anybody decide, you know what, this is just too much. I can't watch anymore. I think that also was missing a little bit. But I'm glad that they did get do a bit of a deep dive into the investigation. And if you saw the actual harness that they held up Owen here, that is, I can understand why Martha was gasped, because I was aghast too. I don't think that would have held me up. And I'm closer to 200 pounds. I know that wouldn't have been able to hold me up. And if I was in Owen's shoes, I would have been scared doing that as well. That is just, there is no way with that harness that would have held a lot up. It barely, Martha talked a little bit about how it was really meant for sailing. It just, again, because the reason they went with this as opposed to what they were doing before is it didn't look as clumsy. It would have looked more smooth when he came down. And it saved 2 seconds. A literal 2 seconds was what they were looking at. And, for some in the TV industry, you're hearing this and you're like, well, 2 seconds may be 2 seconds, but this cost somebody their life. This lack of preparation, this cutting a cost, ended a life. That's simple. And that is, to me, that just is, I'm aghast at that. I'm aghast. Also would have liked to heard that another group I would have liked to have heard from is the company as well. And again, I imagine that those three would have been a little bit tough to get for the producers at the dark side of the ring, but I would have liked to have heard them as well. But it was a gas. And it's so hearing that, and even going up, and when Osh described how that rafter, and Martha described going up to the rafter where Owen was as he was going on his descent and how small that was. It's just hearing from Osh there that I would have been scared. It just really put someone in a very awkward position. And that stunt, I do not believe that stunt has ever been done again. I know Sting never did it. I don't recall that ever being in a WWE show, and I don't think it's ever been done again. But there's still a lot of questions, and I think in terms of the investigation for that, I hope a lot more questions are starting to be asked about that as well. And just the WWE's response to it, countersuing Martha after she's filed her suit, a countersuit. I just, and the scene that they had when Vince McMahon was talking to a reporter. Basically we see Donald Trump do this all the time, but Vince McMahon was treating reporters like crap before Donald Trump was. I guess maybe Trump got some lessons there, maybe, or something. I don't know, but just how he treated that, and the divisiveness of the Hart family to me was. And I understand that Martha's not in great relationship with the Hart. I don't know. That's another, as I'm thinking about this, it would have been interesting to hear from a member of the actual family to get their perspective of, because the fact that there was division, the fact that some literally were according to Martha, was taking things to Vince's, the WWE and their lawyers. The Hart, from some perspective, is that, there was opportunity to still move forward and have a career and be in wrestling. But I would have liked to have heard from them. Because at this particular point in time, I'm struggling to know what I think about that. And as much as it is very easy, and it's just I'm very angry at the WWE and how they handled this night. I would like to hear more from some of the Harts and as to why. And maybe we will never know the real story or that real perspective. I know that they're not in Martha Hart and is not in close relationship with the family. But I would have liked, it would have been nice to hear from one of them if it was at all possible. That to me was unfortunate to hear that. And again, this is a documentary that has an hour, but maybe like I think with the Jimmy Snuka one, this one probably needs a part 2. I think that there's a few things, we can go further into that investigation. We can go further into that lawsuit. We only got a bit into what happened. I think there was so much more going on. I think as well, understanding where Martha Hart is coming from and why, and Oj backed her up with the idea of WWE does not deserve to honor Owen Hart. They do not deserve that credit. Of course, anybody who's seen Owen wrestle or Owen perform would say to you, Owen deserves all of the accolades in the world. But it's certainly not going to come, the WWE is not going to get to honor them. And I think the WWE feels like every other, this is to me where I admire Martha and Oj and Athena, because a lot of other wrestlers that have been put in awkward positions at the WWE seemed to have found a way to reconcile. And, sometimes reconciliation is an important thing, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but if you are standing on a conviction that what was done here was an injustice and what was wrong, I cannot blame Martha or the family for saying, I'm sorry, no. No, the WWE does not get to do that. Now, one of the questions that Chris Jericho put to Martha Hart on the Talk is Jericho podcast was around the idea of having Owen honored at other wrestling companies. And she never really thought about it because he did wrestle in New Japan and he wrestled around the world. Would that be a possibility? And she was open to that idea. So maybe that can happen. And I know that there are Owen Hart t-shirts now and things like that. So that to me, I would, I think that is certainly a possibility. But in terms of the WWE part, I completely respect their decision of not doing it. I stand with them on that. I cannot blame them for that. So in terms of that, so that to me, in terms of where that is, I still think the WWE has some questions to answer, and I really hope some reporters do some digging on this, and I do hope there's a part 2 on this. If I'm the dark side of the ring, I keep digging. I try to dig into this one a little bit more. I think there is a part 2 that a lot of people need to know. And it would be fascinating to kind of know where Chris Jericho ends up in this. He was a guy that spent, he debuted shortly after Owen passed. He had his famous debut with the WWE. He's had a long-term relationship with the WWE. He's not there now, obviously. But I wonder what that does for this relationship going forward. And I sort of wonder if Chris Jericho maybe rejects an idea of going into the Hall of Fame. I don't know. But that's for that. In terms of the other part of this, though, the final part I wanted to get to is what Chris Jericho said at the end. Well, a couple things, but I'll get to. And sort of one of the things about Owen Hart too was he's one of those people that was, there are people in life that are good at things, but they just don't want to do them for the rest of their life. They want to move on to other things. And Owen Hart was at that position where he wanted to do something else. He wanted to spend more time with his family. He wanted to get out of the wrestling business. And at that time he was feeling a little bit low. And what Chris Jericho said at the end was interesting. He's of who that came up in 1999 as some of the stars of like Edge, Christian, Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, even some other people. I think I agree with Chris Jericho, and I never really thought about that, but I think Chris Jericho is right that we would have seen a resurgence of Owen Hart. If he had a match with Kurt Angle, I think that would have been just a really entertaining feud one way or the other. Angle and Owen both had comedic timing, and I think it just would have really entertained people. That would have been a really hot feud. I imagine Owen Hart, here's a couple of scenarios that I think we possibly could have seen. You go to the WrestleMania in Toronto. How about the idea Owen Hart versus Edge, and it's Owen Hart getting Edge over, and that's Edge's biggest win. Edge was on his way to becoming, we were starting to see the rise in 2002 of what Edge could have been to what he is now, but that could have been a very significant win for Edge in Toronto at WrestleMania over Owen Hart. That would have been a really great match and would have propelled Owen, it would have propelled Edge, I think, as well. And then picture this, WrestleMania 20, the place 10 years later, 10 years after he gets his huge win over his brother, he wins the world title. He finally gets that elusive world title win at Madison Square Garden. I think that would have been a very realistic possibility where that would have been a great story. It was Eddie Guerrero that won one match. I mean, you could have had Owen Hart beat Kurt Angle or Owen Hart beat Triple H or whatever, but Owen Hart winning at WrestleMania 20, getting that win, that 10-year story, that would have been just a perfect story as well. I would have imagined, but sadly that didn't happen. But that is, and it's something that I think will, I miss, and I'm really sad that didn't happen, and I continue to miss Owen. And to me, just kind of the closing things is just how Martha saw Owen, as I said, through her eyes, just this wonderful prankster, this wonderful jokester, just a very kind human being, non-judgmental, just one of those people I think we need in this day and age. Just that's that type of person that we just need more Owen Harts in our world, and it's sad that we don't have that. And I felt for Oj, and I felt for Athena, and I just feel for them. And yeah, I feel for his fans, and I'm glad that this opened that story. I'm sad to relive it in one sense, but I'm glad that people are starting to know that legacy of Owen Hart and where that is. And I think wrestling fans, I think it's important to question the WWE about decisions like this. Not only this, but they have a history of doing some really crazy, questionable things. This is not out of the realm. Watch the Dark Side of the Ring of Jimmy Snuka. There's some questions about what Vince McMahon did there. The steroid trial, going to Saudi Arabia just after Jamal Khashoggi. After that, Jamal Khashoggi. Say that name again. You know who I'm talking about, his death. Just, they have taken PR hit after PR hit after PR hit, and they just it doesn't faze them. They just keep going on. But I think it's important as wrestling fans, as wrestling journalists, to continue to ask these questions. And I'm glad the Dark Side of the Ring opened this door. And I truly believe that we need a part 2 of this, for sure. That and Jimmy Snuka. But that's all the time I'm going to take up of here. Again, you can follow me on Twitter, KEBULE, interact with me there. All social media accounts. Agree or disagree with the podcast. Subscribe, rate, say hi. At kevinolenick.com. We're working on that website, getting that recalibrated again. I have a technical issue that we're fixing, so we'll get to that. We also have the hockey podcast. You can also check that out. We'll be back again with an episode this weekend talking about the 2013 NHL draft, the draft of Nail Yakupov. I think that's we're reviewing drafts, and we'll be talking about Nail Yakupov and that draft, and much more, as the NHL has a plan as they're refinalizing or coming out. So check out for that. But thank you for listening to this, and we will talk to you all soon. Bye for now.